Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of Missouri. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1895. The small town of Oakvale, nestled in the wooded hills of southwestern Missouri, was a place where everyone knew their neighbors. A place where doors remained unlocked at night and children played freely until dusk called them home. A place where the local bakery's morning scent would drift through the main street, drawing townsfolk with promises of fresh bread and pleasant conversation. But beneath this veneer of rural tranquility, something unspeakable was taking place at the edge of town, in a modest white farmhouse with blue shutters that had begun to peel from years of neglect. This is the story of Abigail Thornwood, known to locals simply as the Widow, and the terrible secret that would eventually earn her home the whispered name, the Widow's Kitchen. County records show that Abigail Thornwood was born Abigail Pierce in 1843, daughter to a moderately successful cattle farmer. She grew up on a farm approximately 12 miles outside of Springfield, the eldest of 5 children. According to school records preserved in the county archive, Abigail was noted as exceptionally bright, particularly in matters of arithmetic and natural science. Her teacher, a Miss Henrietta Clarkson, noted in her annual assessment of 1857 that young Abigail had a curious mind, perhaps too curious for a girl of her station. This early indication of intellectual curiosity beyond the expected female sphere might have contributed to what neighbors later described as her peculiar manner. She married Thomas Thornwood in 1861, just as the Civil War erupted across the nation. The marriage certificate, still preserved in county records, shows that she was 18 and he was 26, a fairly typical age gap for the period. Thomas owned a modest parcel of land inherited from his father, including the white farmhouse that would later become infamous. The property sat at the edge of Oakvale, far enough from town to offer privacy but close enough to maintain social connections, a geographic position that would later prove significant. Thomas, like many young men from Missouri, joined the Confederate forces, leaving his new bride to maintain their small homestead. According to letters preserved in the Oakvale Historical Society collection, Thomas wrote to Abigail faithfully during his first year of service. The letters reveal a deeply devoted husband concerned primarily with his wife's welfare in his absence. In one dated July 17, 1862, he writes, "My dearest Abigail, I worry constantly about your solitude. It pains me to think of you alone in our home, tending to matters that should be my responsibility. Please accept the assistance offered by my mother, though I know relations between you have been strained." This reference to strained relations with her mother-in-law appears in several letters, suggesting that Abigail's isolation may have been partly self-imposed, a choice rather than merely circumstance. Another letter, dated September 3, 1862, contains what would later seem an eerie foreshadowing. "I dreamt of your bread last night, my love. How strange that in the midst of such carnage I should find myself longing not for safety or home itself, but specifically for the taste of your bread. You have always had a gift for baking that surpasses any I've known." Then, abruptly, the letters stopped. The last communication from Thomas was dated November 18, 1862. It concluded with a troubling passage. "We march tomorrow toward what our captain will say only is a strategic position. The men speak in hushed tones of heavy Union presence in the area. I must maintain hope, but should Providence see fit to call me to judgment, know that my last thoughts will be of you, and of our home, and of the life we will resume when this terrible conflict ends." No official record of Thomas Thornwood's death exists in military archives. His name appears on no casualty lists, no prisoner rolls, no hospital records. He simply vanished, becoming one of the thousands of men from both sides whose fates remained unknown to their families. According to local church records, A memorial service was held for Thomas in 1864, though the pastor noted that Abigail herself did not attend, stating through a messenger that private grief requires private observance. From 1863 to 1891, Abigail Thornwood lived alone in the white farmhouse, supporting herself through a small vegetable garden and by selling eggs from her modest flock of chickens. Neighbors later recalled that she became increasingly reclusive during this period. Martha Jenkins, who lived on the nearest adjacent property, provided a statement to the Oakvale Gazette in 1895. She was always contained. Even before Thomas went away, she kept to herself. But after, well, she became like a shadow. Years would pass when the only proof she still lived was the smoke from her chimney in winter and the occasional glimpse of her tending her garden in summer. The county tax assessor's annual records show that the Thornwood property gradually fell into disrepair. Notes on the 1875 assessment mention deterioration of outbuildings and neglect of fencing. By 1885, the assessment describes the property as maintained at minimal standards, buildings showing significant weathering and lack of repair. Yet curiously, the house itself, particularly the kitchen, was described as kept in good order, suggesting that Abigail's priorities had narrowed to maintaining only the spaces most essential to her daily existence. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely what happened, but how long it continued before anyone noticed. According to the Oakvale Gazette's archives, between 1891 and 1895, no fewer than 7 travelers were reported missing after passing through the area. Yet no connection was made to the widow who lived alone at the edge of town, the woman who had begun selling her homemade bread at the local market. The first of these disappearances, documented in the October 14, 1891 edition of the Gazette, concerned a tinker named Michael Donovan. The article, just 3 paragraphs long, stated only that an itinerant repairman of cookware and farm implements, having passed through Oakvale in early October, failed to arrive at his next expected destination of Carthage. Any persons having information should contact Sheriff Collins. No follow-up article ever appeared. In February of 1892, another brief notice appeared regarding a missing cattle buyer, Samuel Whitfield, who had been traveling through the region purchasing livestock for transport to Kansas City. Again, the matter received little attention. Rural Missouri in the late 19th century was still in many ways a frontier region. Men appeared and disappeared regularly, following work, running from debts or law, or simply seeking new opportunities further west. It's worth noting that this period coincided with Abigail Thornwood's emergence from her long seclusion. In the spring of 1891, she appeared at the Oakvale market for the first time in nearly a decade, carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth. Beneath the cloth were 6 loaves of dark, densely textured bread. According to market records, she sold all 6 loaves within an hour, despite charging nearly twice the price of the town bakery. Mary Hollister, who ran a fabric stall at the market, later told investigators, "People were curious, I suppose. The widow had been almost a ghost story to some of the younger folk, the strange woman who lived alone at the edge of town. And there was something compelling about her bread. The look of it, the smell, different from ordinary bread somehow, richer, more substantial." The first peculiar observation came from Elmer Whitman, the town's only doctor. In his medical journal dated March 1894, he noted, "Called to the Thornwood residence today. The widow complains of stomach ailments, though I suspect her real condition is one of the mind. The house carries an unusual odor, not quite decay, something more mineral. She refused to let me see the back rooms, prescribed mild sedative, and recommended fresh air." Dr. Whitman's journal continues, "Widow Thornwood's hands were stained dark beneath the nails. When questioned, she stated she had been grinding her own flour. Most unusual, as the town mill serves everyone adequately. I observed that the skin of her hands appeared unusually rough and reddened, consistent with frequent exposure to heat and abrasive materials. When I remarked upon this, she concealed her hands in the folds of her dress and abruptly terminated our consultation. A week later, Dr. Whitman made another entry. Encountered widow Thornwood at market today. She appeared much recovered from her supposed ailments. She offered me a loaf of her bread at no charge, stating it would strengthen the constitution. I accepted out of professional courtesy. The bread has an unusual density and a slightly gritty texture, though the flavor is not unpleasant. There is an earthy quality to it that lingers on the palate. Abigail's bread gained something of a following in Oakvale. Described in a local advertisement as having a hearty character unlike any other, her loaves commanded prices nearly twice that of the town bakery. Mrs. Eleanor Pearson, wife of the town's postmaster, noted in her personal diary that the widow's bread had a peculiar density and a mineral quality that sits strangely on the tongue, yet one finds oneself thinking of it hours later, craving another slice. By 1894, the widow's bread had become a staple at town events. Church records indicate that she donated loaves to the Harvest Festival that autumn and to a benefit for the new school building. Reverend Joseph Harmon wrote in the church newsletter, "We extend our gratitude to Widow Thornwood for her generous contribution to our fellowship meal." Her unique bread was particularly appreciated by the men of the congregation, who remarked upon its substantial nature and fortifying effect. It was during this period of increasing community integration that Abigail began to invite select individuals to her home. According to testimony later collected by Sheriff Collins, she would approach men traveling alone, peddlers, laborers, drifters, and offer them a meal and a place to rest. Martha Jenkins recalled seeing at least 5 or 6 different men enter the Thornwood property between 1893 and 1895. "I thought perhaps she was finally overcoming her grief," Jenkins stated, that perhaps she was considering remarriage, or at least companionship in her advancing years. None of the men seen entering the Thornwood house were ever seen leaving. The pivotal moment came in April of 1895. A young man named James Harrington, working as an apprentice to the county surveyor, was tasked with updating property maps of the area. According to his official report preserved in county records, he required access to the rear portion of the Thornwood property, which contained a small creek that served as a natural boundary. Harrington's report states, "Upon approaching the rear of the Thornwood residence, I observed smoke rising from what appeared to be an outdoor baking oven of unusual size. As no one answered my calls, I proceeded with my measurements. Behind the oven I discovered what appeared to be a midden heap of considerable size. Protruding from this waste pile was what I first took to be the remains of a butchered animal. Upon closer inspection, I identified human finger bones." The report continues. Further examination revealed fragments of larger human bones, many showing signs of having been subjected to extreme heat and then broken open. Some pieces appeared to have been ground down. I departed immediately to alert Sheriff Collins. In his personal journal, which was not made public until 1962, when it was donated to the Oakvale Historical Society by his daughter, Harrington provided additional details. "The sight of those bones, so clearly human yet treated like kitchen waste, caused in me a revulsion so profound I found myself unable to speak for several minutes. What disturbed me most was not merely their presence, but the methodical nature of their processing. These were not the remains of a murder hastily concealed. They had been handled with purpose, with a craftsman's attention to detail. The long bones had been split precisely to extract their marrow. The smaller bones showed evidence of careful sorting. This was not chaos or madness. This was system and design." Sheriff William Collins's initial report, filed the same day, indicates his skepticism. Young Harrington seems to be blessed with an overactive imagination. Nevertheless, duty compels investigation. The brevity of this note suggests Collins expected to find nothing of concern at the Thornwood property. The sheriff's subsequent report, filed the following day, stands in stark contrast. "Upon arrival at the Thornwood residence, I was greeted by the widow herself. She appeared composed and invited me to take coffee in her kitchen. I observed nothing unusual until I requested to see the outdoor oven Harrington had described. The widow's demeanor changed immediately. She refused, stating that her baking methods were a family secret. When pressed, she became agitated. Collins continues, I proceeded to the rear of the property despite her objections. The oven was as Harrington described. Nearby stood a large grinding stone similar to those used in mills, but of a size manageable by a single person. The stone carried dark stains. What appeared to be bone fragments were visible in the surrounding soil. Upon seeing me examine these items, the widow fled inside the house and barred the door. A supplementary report, marked confidential and sealed until 1958, adds, before fleeing inside, the widow made a statement I initially dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. She said, they needed purpose, I gave them permanence. Through me, they nourish the whole town. Is that not a kind of salvation? When I attempted to question her further on her meaning, she refused to elaborate and retreated into the house. What followed was a 5-hour standoff that ended only when Collins, joined by 3 deputies, forced entry into the home. What they discovered inside would haunt Oakvale for generations. The official inventory of the Thornwood residence, completed on April 17, 1895, documents the following. In the root cellar, accessed through the kitchen floor, deputies discovered the partial remains of what appears to be 3 adult humans. The remains show evidence of butchery using common kitchen implements. A large metal pot contained what appears to be rendered human fat. The kitchen contained 3 barrels of coarse flour-like substance that, upon examination, proves to be ground bone mixed with conventional wheat flour. The inventory continues with clinical precision. The kitchen was found to be meticulously organized with specialized tools arranged by function. Of particular note was a set of butcher's implements, well-maintained and of professional quality, hanging on the north wall. A large work table in the center of the room showed evidence of heavy use, with deep score marks consistent with butchery. The fireplace was unusually large for a residential kitchen, capable of accommodating a rendering pot of substantial size. Deputy Marshal Thompson, the youngest of the men who entered the house that day, later resigned from his position and left Oakvale entirely. In a letter to his mother, found among her effects after her death in 1932, he wrote, "What we found in that cellar was bad enough. The remains were, I cannot describe them even now, but worse was the realization that those same hands that had done such things had also baked the bread we had all eaten, that the same mind that could conceive of such acts could also move among us, attending church, exchanging pleasantries at market. I can no longer trust what appears normal on its surface. I must leave this place." Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a journal kept by Abigail Thornwood herself. Written in a precise, almost clerical hand, it detailed her activities with dispassionate clarity. The journal was confiscated as evidence and sealed by court order in 1896, but excerpts were leaked to the press. According to the St. Louis Dispatch of May 1895, sources close to the investigation reveal that the accused maintained meticulous records of her activities, including recipes and notes on the quality of different individuals. The writings suggest a mind entirely divorced from moral considerations. One leaked excerpt described her method. The processing must begin promptly. Delay results in a product of inferior quality. The subject should be bled completely before any cutting begins. The larger bones require roasting at high temperature for no less than 6 hours before they will yield properly to the grinding stone. The smaller bones can be processed more quickly, but provide less substance to the final mixture. Another passage, reportedly from the earliest entries in the journal, offered a glimpse into the evolution of her practices. "Today, I made the first trial. Used only a small amount, mixed with the regular flour. The result was superior to any previous bread I have baked. There is a richness, a depth of flavor that cannot be achieved by conventional means. I am convinced that this is the method T would have wanted me to discover, a way to make something valuable from what would otherwise be waste." During her interrogation, Abigail remained largely silent. When asked about her victims, she reportedly said only, "They were already empty inside. I simply made use of their shells." When pressed on how she selected those who would enter her home but never leave, she offered a more cryptic response. "I could smell the loneliness on them. No one would miss such men." Court records indicate that all of the identified victims were indeed transient males, laborers, drifters, and peddlers passing through Oakvale, men whose disappearances might go unnoticed or be attributed to the natural movement of itinerant workers. According to the widow's journal, her first victim was a tinker who stopped to repair her cookware in the autumn of 1891. The journal entry for that day reads, "The tinker repaired my large pot today. His hands were skilled, but his eyes were empty. He told me he had been on the road for 30 years and had no family to speak of. When I offered him supper, he accepted readily. He asked no questions when I added the sedative to his coffee. He simply closed his eyes as if grateful for rest. It was quick. He felt nothing. Now he will serve a purpose greater than his lonely wandering." Subsequent entries detailed a pattern: identification of suitable victims, a meal offered, sedation, and then the methodical processing of remains. The clinical tone never wavered, suggesting that in Abigail's mind, her actions were no more morally significant than slaughtering livestock or harvesting crops, simply a form of resource acquisition and processing. The question that dominated local discourse was simple. Why had no one noticed? How had a woman been killing, processing, and, most horrifically, feeding human remains to the very community that would eventually condemn her, all without raising alarm? Sheriff Collins addressed this in his final report on the case. It appears that the widow's integration into community life, coupled with her status as a respected longtime resident, provided effective cover for her activities. The remote location of her home, situated a half-mile from the nearest neighbor, further facilitated concealment. Additionally, the limited connectivity between rural communities meant that reports of missing persons from neighboring towns rarely reached Oakvale with any urgency. The report continues, "The method of disposal was particularly effective. By incorporating processed remains into bread consumed by the community, the widow essentially enlisted the entire town as unwitting accomplices in the elimination of evidence. This distribution of evidence across numerous unwitting individuals represents a strategy of concealment that, while abhorrent, demonstrates a disturbing level of practical ingenuity." But perhaps the most unsettling explanation came from Mrs. Pearson, the postmaster's wife, who had frequently purchased the widow's bread. In a statement to the Oakvale Gazette, she said, "We all knew something wasn't quite right about Abigail after Thomas never returned. The way she would stare at nothing, the way she spoke about her bread as if it were alive. But no one wanted to see what was in front of them. It was easier to take her bread and nod politely than to ask questions no one wanted answered." She elaborated, "There was always something uncanny about the way people responded to her bread. Men particularly seemed drawn to it. My husband would ask specifically for it, claiming no other bread satisfied his hunger in quite the same way. When I suggested once that perhaps we should patronize the town bakery instead, to support a family business rather than a widow who needed no additional income, he became uncharacteristically agitated. It was as if the very suggestion caused him physical discomfort. The town's collective blindness ended only when confronted with evidence too concrete to ignore. When deputies brought samples of the widow's flour to town and displayed them at the courthouse, more than one resident became physically ill upon realizing what they had been consuming. Reverend Harmon addressed his congregation the Sunday following Abigail's arrest. His sermon, preserved in church records, attempted to make theological sense of what had occurred. "We have participated unknowingly in an abomination. Our bodies have become vessels for a terrible sin. Yet I must remind you that unwitting participation does not constitute moral failing. We must now focus on the cleansing of our community, both physically and spiritually." The Reverend went on to organize a community-wide fast encouraging parishioners to purge their bodies of what they had consumed. He also led a prayer vigil outside the jail where Abigail was held, though witnesses later reported that the prayers seemed directed less toward her salvation than toward protection from her influence. Abigail Thornwood was never brought to trial. On the morning she was to be transferred to the county seat for arraignment, she was found dead in her cell. The official cause was listed as heart failure, though rumors persisted that certain townsfolk had taken justice into their own hands. No investigation into her death was pursued. Dr. Whitman, who examined the body, noted in his medical journal, "The deceased showed no external signs of violence. However, the facial expression was one of extreme terror, suggesting that whatever ended her life caused significant distress in her final moments. I cannot definitively state whether this was due to natural causes or some form of induced terror. Given the circumstances, a more thorough examination seems politically inadvisable." The Thornwood house was burned to the ground in May of 1895 by order of the town council. Salt was reportedly spread over the foundation, not from any legal requirement, but as a folk remedy to purify the land. Despite these efforts, nothing would grow on the property for years afterward, according to local accounts. Martha Jenkins, whose property adjoined the Thornwood land, stated in 1905, "For 10 years now, that patch of earth has rejected every seed. We've tried crop and flower alike. Nothing takes root there. It's as if the very soil remembers what was done and refuses to participate in new life." The case might have faded into local legend had it not been for a series of academic inquiries beginning in 1952. Dr. Margaret Holcomb, a professor of criminal psychology at Washington University in St. Louis, petitioned for access to the sealed court records as part of a study on female serial murderers, a category then considered extremely rare. Dr. Holcomb's notes, preserved in the university archives, reveal her fascination with the case. What distinguishes the Thornwood case from other recorded instances of female-perpetrated serial murder is not merely the number of victims, but the elaborate processing of remains. This suggests not a crime of passion or necessity, but one of ritual and perhaps disturbed creativity. He continues, "Most striking is the community participation, albeit unwitting, in the consumption of the processed remains. This creates a macabre communion between killer and community that appears unprecedented in the literature." Dr. Holcomb visited Oakvale in the summer of 1953, attempting to interview elderly residents who might have direct recollections of the events. Her research journal records the difficulty she encountered. "The town maintains a collective silence about the Thornwood case. Those old enough to remember either claim no knowledge or offer only the most superficial comments before changing the subject. It is as if a community-wide agreement exists to excise this event from local history." One exception was Eliza Carter, who had been 10 years old in 1895. Now approaching 70, she provided Dr. Holcomb with a child's perspective on the events. "I remember my parents arguing about the widow's bread. My father loved it, said it gave him strength like nothing else. My mother became suspicious after a while. She said it wasn't natural how people craved it. The morning after the widow was arrested, my father sat at the breakfast table and wept. Not for the victims, though that came later, but because he realized he would never taste that bread again. Even knowing what it contained, part of him still wanted it." Dr. Holcomb's research was abruptly discontinued in 1954. University records indicate only that she requested a leave of absence for health reasons and never returned to her position. Her research materials were archived without publication. A colleague, Dr. James Moorfield, later wrote that Dr. Holcomb had become increasingly paranoid during her research, claiming that she was being followed and that her notes were being tampered with. In a letter to the department chair requesting her leave of absence, she reportedly wrote, "I have come to believe that some histories are better left unexamined. Some patterns of human behavior, once recognized, cannot be unseen, and their recognition changes the observer in ways that cannot be reversed. In 1968, during renovations to the Oakvale courthouse, workers discovered a sealed metal box in a wall cavity. Inside was a bundle of papers identified as the missing portions of Abigail Thornwood's journal, apparently hidden by someone involved in the original investigation. The contents were immediately classified and transferred to state archives, where they remained until being microfilmed and subsequently lost during a facility reorganization in 1969. However, before their disappearance, a court clerk reportedly read portions of the journal. According to an interview published in the Oakvale Centennial History, 1967, the clerk stated, "What struck me wasn't the acts she described, horrible as they were. It was how she wrote about the bread. She believed she was doing something almost holy, preserving these men forever by making them part of the community that had rejected them in life. In her mind, she was granting a kind of immortality. This spiritual or transformative element adds another layer to an already disturbing case. Was Abigail Thornwood merely a killer, or did she see herself as performing some twisted sacrament? The loss of the complete journal means we may never fully understand her motivations. What we do know comes from the fragments of her writing that survived in the official record. The process is not simple. The bones must be baked until they become brittle, then ground very fine. Too coarse, and people notice. Too fine, and the bread loses its substance. The right mixture makes a loaf that stands apart, something people crave without knowing why. Another entry reads, "T would be proud of how I've maintained our home, how I've ensured we're never truly alone. The men who pass through become part of us, part of Oakvale itself. Their strength enters those who eat my bread. Nothing is wasted." The reference to T is presumed to be her husband Thomas, who never returned from the war. No record of his death exists in military archives, and his body was never recovered. This has led some researchers to speculate that Thomas's disappearance may have triggered Abigail's descent into murderous behavior, though this remains conjecture. A particularly disturbing entry, dated Christmas Day 1892, reads, "Today I baked 12 loaves using the last of J.F., presumably James Farley, a cattle driver reported missing in November 1892, took 7 to the church dinner, watched as Reverend Harmon broke the bread and passed it among the congregation. This is my body, which is broken for you." He spoke the words without knowing their truth. I alone understood the genuine communion taking place. The wanderer who would have died alone on some distant trail instead became part of a community celebration. His substance now sustains the very people who would have ignored him in life. Is this not a form of grace? This entry suggests that Abigail may have developed a personal theology around her actions, a framework that recast her murders as acts of spiritual transformation rather than violence. The religious overtones, particularly the perversion of Christian communion rituals, add a dimension of blasphemy that would have been particularly shocking in the deeply religious community of 19th century rural Missouri. Local historian Edwin Porter, writing in 1963, offered this assessment. The Civil War left invisible wounds throughout the South and border states, widows with no bodies to bury. Men who returned changed beyond recognition. Communities fractured by divided loyalties. In this context, Abigail Thornwood's madness takes on a different cast, not as an isolated aberration, but as perhaps the most extreme manifestation of a broader social trauma. Porter continues, Missouri's particular position in the conflict, a slave state that remained in the Union with citizens fighting on both sides, created unique tensions. Neighbor truly did turn against neighbor, family against family. The usual support systems that might have helped someone like Abigail process her grief were themselves damaged by the war. Her isolation was both literal and symbolic of the fractured community bonds throughout the region. The physical evidence from the case has largely disappeared. The grinding stone was initially preserved as evidence, but was later destroyed by court order. Samples of the bone flour were sent to medical examiners in St. Louis, but were reportedly disposed of after analysis. All that remains are the written records and the persistent memory in Oakvale itself. Even today, older residents of the region are reportedly reluctant to discuss the widow's kitchen. According to a folklore study conducted in 1965, several superstitions arose in the wake of the case. Local bakers would make a small cut in the top of bread loaves, supposedly to let the spirits escape. Children were taught never to accept food from strangers, and for decades the site where the Thornwood house once stood remained vacant, with no one willing to build there despite the prime location. The study documented one particularly macabre practice. Until approximately 1930, it was common for mothers in the Oakvale region to warn misbehaving children that the widow would put them in her bread if they didn't improve their behavior. This threat eventually died out as the direct memory of the case faded, but it illustrates how deeply the Thornwood case penetrated the collective psyche of the community. In 1957, the land was finally purchased by the county and converted into a small park. No marker or plaque acknowledges the history of the site. It is as if the town collectively decided to erase all physical reminders of what occurred there. Yet the story persists, passed down through generations, changing slightly with each telling, but retaining its essential horror. An oral history project conducted by the Missouri Historical Society in 1962 recorded this statement from Harold Jenkins, grandson of Martha Jenkins. "My grandmother wouldn't talk about it directly, but sometimes, when baking bread, she'd become very particular about the ingredients. She'd say, 'Always know what goes into your bread, child. Always know.' It wasn't until I was older that I understood what she meant, that she had been one of those who had eaten the widow's bread. What makes the case of Abigail Thornwood so disturbing is not just the acts themselves, but how they expose the fragility of community trust. The people of Oakvale quite literally consumed what she offered without question, incorporating her victims into themselves in the most intimate way possible. In doing so, they became unwitting participants in her crime, a realization that, according to newspaper accounts of the time, led several residents to leave Oakvale permanently, unable to face their neighbors knowing what they had shared. The case raises uncomfortable questions about how well we truly know those around us and about the unspoken agreements that allow communities to function, the collective willingness to not look too closely at what might disturb the social order. Dr. Holcomb, before abandoning her research, wrote, "The most terrifying aspect of the Thornwood case may be its implication that monstrosity can exist in plain sight, can even be welcomed into our homes and bodies if presented in a form we are prepared to accept. The boundary between the normal and the abhorrent may be as thin and permeable as the crust on a loaf of bread." The last known document relating directly to Abigail Thornwood is a request for a proper Christian burial submitted by a distant cousin from Illinois in 1896. The request was denied by town officials. According to cemetery records, she was interred in unmarked ground beyond the boundaries of the town cemetery, neither within the community nor fully outside it, a liminal space reflecting her ambiguous status. A notation in the cemetery registry, made by the caretaker at the time, reads simply, "Burial completed as directed by town council. No marker, no service." Site to remain undisclosed. This effectively erased even her final resting place from public knowledge, a final attempt to expunge her existence from the community's visible history. A final disturbing coda to the story emerged in 1968. During construction of a new road near where the old Thornwood property had stood, workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 3 feet below ground. Inside was a single sheet of paper, apparently torn from a journal, and a small cloth pouch containing what appeared to be flour. The paper, according to the construction foreman's statement to local police, contained just one line of text: "We continue together in those who received us." The pouch and paper were sent to the county sheriff's office, but were subsequently lost during an office relocation in 1969. Robert Collins, grandson of Sheriff William Collins, and himself a deputy at the time, later claimed that the contents of the pouch were indeed analyzed before their disappearance. The lab confirmed it was just ordinary flour, he stated in a 1975 interview. But that almost makes it worse, doesn't it? The suggestion that something might be there, even when it isn't. That's how she continues to affect people, making us question what we consume, what we take into ourselves. Some speculate that Abigail may have buried similar packages throughout the area, final offerings from a woman who believed she was creating something that transcended ordinary human existence. Others suggest the items were planted long after her death, perhaps by someone seeking to extend the legend. Whatever the truth, the story of the widow's kitchen remains a whispered caution in the region, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who have learned to provide exactly what their communities hunger for, and that acceptance can sometimes be more dangerous than rejection. In the years since, numerous attempts have been made to definitively count Abigail Thornwood's victims. The official record lists 7 confirmed missing persons who likely fell prey to her, but folklore and some historical analyses suggest the number could be much higher. Given the transient nature of many laborers in the post-Civil War period and the poor record-keeping in rural areas, the true count may never be known. Dr. Elias Thornton, no relation, a forensic anthropologist who examined photographs of the remains in 1962, wrote, "Based on the fragmentary evidence available, I would estimate that the remains found in the Thornwood cellar represented at least 5 distinct individuals, and possibly as many as 8. However, given the processing method described in the reports, which involved grinding bones to powder, the total number of victims could be substantially higher. A conservative estimate, based on the quantity of processed material reportedly found, would suggest a minimum of 12 victims, and potentially many more. What is known is that for nearly 4 years the widow served her special bread to neighbors, to church gatherings, to harvest festivals. She watched as parents fed it to their children. According to Mrs. Pearson's diary, Abigail would often refuse payment from families with young children, insisting it was her contribution to their growth. This particular detail caused significant distress when the truth emerged, with many parents experiencing what one doctor described as acute melancholia upon realizing what they had fed to their children. The psychological impact on the community, once the truth was revealed, was severe and long-lasting. Church attendance in Oakvale reportedly doubled in the months following the discovery, as residents sought spiritual cleansing. According to the pastor's records, many requested private confession for the sin of unwitting cannibalism, though no Christian doctrine specifically addresses such a situation. Reverend Harmon's diary, discovered after his death in 1912, reveals his own struggle to provide spiritual guidance in unprecedented circumstances. How does one counsel those who have unknowingly participated in such an abomination? There is no theological framework for this specific sin. I find myself improvising rituals of purification, knowing they have no scriptural basis, but recognizing the desperate need for some form of cleansing ceremony. The Reverend created a special service held monthly throughout 1895 and 1896, which he called the Restoration of Innocence. The liturgy, preserved in church records, included prayers specifically written to address the unique spiritual contamination the congregation felt. Lord, we who have been defiled without knowledge, or consent seek thy purification. Cleanse our bodies of that which was taken in ignorance. Wash away the stain that touches both flesh and spirit. Medical records from the period indicate a sharp increase in reported digestive complaints, despite no evidence of actual physical contamination remaining in those who had consumed the bread. Dr. Whitman noted in his journal, "I am treating dozens of patients who present with symptoms that appear to be largely psychosomatic: nausea, digestive distress, insomnia. Their bodies are physically unaffected, yet the knowledge of what they have consumed continues to manifest as physical distress. The mind's power over the body has never been more clearly demonstrated. The town's economic life was also affected. The local bakery, which had struggled to compete with Abigail's popular bread, now found itself under suspicion simply by association. Baker Frederick Mueller, though completely uninvolved in the crimes, reported a significant drop in business. According to his financial ledgers, sales decreased by nearly 60% in the months following the discovery. "People look at all bread differently now," he was quoted as saying in the Gazette. "They want to know exactly what's in it." Some have given it up entirely. The market itself, where Abigail had sold her bread for years, temporarily closed and reopened in a new location, as if the physical space had been contaminated by association. Town records show that the original market building remained vacant for nearly 2 years before being repurposed as a storage facility. Perhaps most affecting were the personal relationships damaged by the knowledge of shared consumption. Martha Jenkins wrote in her diary, "James, her husband, and I can scarcely look at each other across the dinner table. We both know what we have eaten, what we have become by eating it. We are bound together now, not just by our marriage vows, but by this terrible communion. We have both become repositories for the dead." Today, the story has largely faded from public consciousness outside the immediate region. No major books have been published on the case. No films have dramatized it. The academic papers that do reference it often do so only in passing, as a footnote in larger studies of rural crime or female murderers. This scholarly neglect may be partly due to the limited primary sources available, with so many records lost or sealed. But several researchers have suggested that the very nature of the crime, its violation of the deepest taboos around food and incorporation of the dead, makes it resistant to academic treatment. As one anthropologist noted in a 1983 paper, the Thornwood case exists in a blind spot of academic inquiry, too disturbing to examine directly, but too significant to ignore completely. Perhaps this is fitting. The horror of Abigail Thornwood's crime lies not in spectacular violence or overtly evil intent, but in its quiet integration into the everyday, in its breaching of the most fundamental taboos while maintaining an appearance of normalcy, in its transformation of the mundane, the daily bread that sustains life, into a vehicle for death. A psychological assessment conducted posthumously by Dr. Victor Schrader in 1956, based on the available records, suggested that Abigail likely suffered from what would now be classified as a severe delusional disorder, possibly triggered by the trauma of her husband's disappearance. Dr. Schrader wrote, "The subject appears to have constructed an alternate reality in which her actions were not only justified but redemptive. The religious symbolism in her writings suggests she viewed herself not as a killer but as a kind of priestess, transforming the socially marginal into something central to community life." He continues, "The focus on bread, a powerful symbol in Christian theology, as well as a basic sustenance, indicates a conflation of spiritual and physical nourishment in her disordered thinking. By making her victims literally become the community's sustenance, she may have believed she was elevating them from their marginal status to a position of essential importance." This interpretation is supported by entries in her journal that refer to her victims as vessels and carriers, suggesting she saw them not as individuals, but as vehicles for a transformation she was orchestrating. One entry reads, "D.S., presumed to be Daniel Smith, a peddler reported missing in June 1893, claimed to have traveled to every state in the Union. Now his travels will continue in a different form, moving through the bodies of everyone who takes him in." Is this not a kind of immortality? The widow's kitchen stands as a testament to how easily the unthinkable can become part of our lives if presented in familiar form, and how willingly we might consume what should repel us, if only it is baked into something we already accept as nourishing. As one final unsettling note, according to an oral history recorded in 1963, some residents of Oakvale reported that even after learning the truth about the widow's bread, they still sometimes found themselves craving its distinctive taste. As one elderly woman put it, "May God forgive me, but nothing since has ever satisfied the same way." This persistent craving, even in the face of full knowledge, suggests a disturbing truth about human nature, that our body's desires can operate independently from our moral understanding, creating a disconnect between what we know to be repugnant and what we physically desire. Dr. Holcomb touched on this in her final notes before abandoning her research. The most unsettling testimonies come from those who acknowledge continued craving for the bread even after learning its contents. This suggests that taboo violation, once experienced, creates a complex psychological response that cannot be reduced to simple revulsion. The body remembers pleasures the mind wishes to forget. The case also raises questions about the nature of community complicity. While the people of Oakvale were unquestionably victims of Abigail's deception, some researchers have suggested that their willing consumption of bread that was noticeably different, bread that, as multiple accounts attest, had a mineral quality and unusual texture, indicates a kind of willful ignorance. Sociologist Dr. Rachel Freeman, in a 1977 paper titled "Collective Blindness, Community Participation in the Thornwood Case," argued, "The residents of Oakvale accepted an obviously unusual food source without serious question for years." This suggests not merely being deceived, but being receptive to deception. The community's desire for the special qualities of the widow's bread, its substantial nature, its satisfying effect, overrode the natural suspicion that something markedly different from normal bread should have aroused. This willingness to consume without questioning may have parallels in other aspects of community life. The acceptance of convenient narratives, the overlooking of troubling patterns, the collective agreement to not examine too closely that which provides satisfaction or stability. In a small corner of the Oakvale Cemetery, far from the maintained family plots, the ground dips slightly where an unmarked grave has settled over decades. No flowers are ever seen there. No visitors stop to pay respects. But locals say that sometimes, on very still mornings, the faint smell of baking bread seems to rise from the earth itself, a reminder that some hungers never truly die and some secrets never fully stay buried. This detail, likely apocryphal, nevertheless captures something essential about the case, the way it lingers in the community's consciousness, resisting all efforts at complete erasure. The physical evidence may be gone, the record sealed or lost, but the essential horror of the widow's kitchen remains, a cautionary tale passed through generations. In 1967, when the Missouri Highway Department proposed building a rest stop on the former Thornwood property, they encountered unexpected local resistance. No formal reason was given for the opposition, but according to department records, a delegation from Oakvale requested a meeting with the project planners and simply stated that the location was unsuitable and would not be restful to travelers. The project was relocated 2 miles further east. Perhaps the final word on the case should go to Eliza Carter, who as a child had witnessed the events and as an elderly woman provided one of the last first-hand accounts. In her interview with Dr. Holcomb in 1953, she concluded, "People want to make her into a monster, something completely different from themselves. But the truth that no one wants to face is that she was one of us. She sat in church, she shopped at market, she nodded hello on the street, and we welcomed what she offered. We consumed it eagerly. That's what keeps people awake at night, even now. Not just what she did, but how easily we accepted it." The story of Abigail Thornwood and her terrible bread continues to resonate because it touches on fears more fundamental than simple violence or death. It speaks to anxieties about incorporation and contamination, about community trust and betrayal, about the unknown contents of what we consume both physically and metaphorically. In the end, the widow's kitchen represents a perfect storm of horror, a violation of the deepest taboos around food and death, committed by a seemingly ordinary member of the community with the unwitting participation of the entire town. It is a story of boundaries crossed that can never be uncrossed, of a communion too terrible to acknowledge but impossible to forget. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the suggestion, whispered by some who study the case, that the widow achieved exactly what she intended, a kind of immortality, not just for her victims, but for herself. As long as her story continues to be told, as long as the thought of her bread continues to unsettle those who hear it, Abigail Thornwood remains unburied and persistent presence that, like her bread, has been taken into the body of her community, impossible to fully digest or expel.